BBC News.
Now, on BBC Radio 4, it's time for the Moral Maze. Live as usual, here's Michael Buerk.
Good evening. Nearly all blessings are mixed. Longevity certainly is. Our healthier lives and better medical care mean 1 in 3 babies born today can expect to live to 100, which is good news. And as a result, many more of us will die the lingering deaths of old age, cancer, dementia, stroke, which isn't. So the government's decision this week not to stand in the way of legalising assisted dying has possible implications for all of us. At present, helping somebody to end their life carries a maximum penalty of 14 years in jail. A new bill that will shortly come to a free vote in Parliament will make it legal if the patient is terminally ill with less than 6 months to live and 2 doctors authorise it. This would bring us into line with European countries like the Netherlands and some US states. Belgium has just gone further and legalised assisted dying for terminally ill children. The arguments on both sides are powerful and emotive. The sanctity of life, given many would say by God and only for him to take away. The danger that the old, the vulnerable, the disabled will be pressured to end their lives, not be a burden, by self-interested relatives. Many see a slippery slope once the principle is broken and point to abortion as a case in point. But the manifest cruelty in keeping somebody alive against their will, perhaps in terrible pain that cannot always be controlled even today, is not easy to justify. Then there's the principle of moral autonomy. My life, my death. Tonight's Moral Maze, really a matter of life and death. Our panel, Anne McElvoy, Public Policy Editor of The Economist, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, the Chief Executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor, and Giles Fraser, the Anglican priest and controversialist. Giles, your church has long taken an adamantine view on this. Do you share it?
I'm against assisted dying, but I don't think that's so much a church thing. I mean, actually, if you look at the statistics on this, that religious people are just as much in favour, or pretty roughly in favour of assisted dying as the population in general. No, I worry that we're a society afraid of death and we try and push it out of the way and dying all the time.
Anne McElvoy?
Well, my gut response is that we do have to tread very carefully here. And you mentioned that tension between the universal and the personal in your introduction, Michael. But I think the fact that we are going to have a larger number of ageing people, we do have many very difficult conditions in the lead up to death for a lot of people. So I think we also have to face up to the fact that we will have to reconsider assisted dying, and that many people actually would like to have it as an option for themselves.
Claire Fox?
Well, I have a real moral dilemma, genuinely, because I believe in personal freedom. But I have to say that in this instance, giving Parliament giving the power to others to take lives scares me. And I just feel queasy about a kind of cultural pessimism that when somebody's in despair at their own suffering, that we as a society say, yes, go on, go. I just want to cry, don't. It's always worth living.
Matthew Taylor?
This is a complex matter and the devil's in the detail, but in essence, I believe it is a moral imperative that we allow people autonomy over their own bodies, including allowing them to ask for help to end their lives.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. I should say that all our witnesses this week have positions on this that have been shaped by their own personal experience. Our first witness is Dr. Graham Wynyard, retired public health physician, formerly medical director of the NHS in England, whose views on this are coloured by nursing his wife, Sandy, who died of cancer a decade ago now. Was it, it's a difficult concept, I know, but was it a good death in all the circumstances?
It was a lovely death in all the circumstances, and that's one of the things that really got me actively campaigning. Because of her particular medical circumstances, she was being kept alive by steroids, and there came a point when, although she was at home, we had wonderful care, no pain, but she just had enough. And she said to me, they treat cats and dogs better than they treat humans. And our GP came again and discussed the situation with her, changed what was in the drip, gave her an injection. We all said our goodbyes, and she lapsed into unconsciousness with me and the children sitting around the bed, and we were reading poetry. And while it was awful, and we didn't want her to go, that created something that was healing and positive.
Just very briefly, that happened under the existing system.
Yes.
Why did we need to change it?
That was because she was lucky, because she was being kept alive by something that could be withdrawn. My very good friend Anne McPherson, who another campaigner for assisted dying, was in a similar situation. She wanted to die, but she wasn't being kept alive, and she had what her daughter described as 3 weeks of hell.
I understand. Giles Fraser.
Will you forgive me for asking quite a direct question? I mean, in such a distressing circumstance, it's obviously very distressing to watch someone that you love die. But did you ever worry that your wife's decision to concede to the choice that killed her was in some sense motivated by the distress she saw she was causing you at her dying? Did you ever worry at all about that?
I didn't, because I didn't want her to die. I wanted her to stay a bit longer, but that was selfish from my point of view.
But she was seeing distress in you, I presume, and that...
She might have been, but I just don't think that was a factor in her case. I could imagine it might be in other people. I don't think it was with her.
I mean, if we broaden it out,
Yes.
if we broaden it out then, because there is this anxiety, isn't it, that if you change the rules, then people are beginning to go, look, I'm a financial burden, I'm causing huge distress in the house and lingering death, probably better that I go.
Well, that's certainly theoretically possible.
It's probably a bit more than theoretically possible,
Well,
isn't it?
what I was going to say, one of the things we've got with this situation, the bill we're campaigning for is based on Oregon, as you know, where they've been doing this for 16 years. So you can go and look and see what actually happens in practice over a long period of time, and these sort of factors are not important. The people opting to die are people who...
But we're talking about motivation
Yes.
here, and it's a subtle and slippery thing. If I know that if I'm dying and there's people around me that I'm causing distress to through my death, and I can then begin to, as it were, to sort of second guess what you want, start to sort of take that into account, and you can't judge that by just looking at someone. It actually is something that's a very private thing that you can't see by going to Oregon.
Of course, but it's a very noble thing as well. It can be. It can be a very genuine reason.
Quite right. It can be a
Yes.
genuine thing. So I can want to die because I don't want the distress caused by others. But then there are sort of like darker forms of that, aren't there? Which is to say that other people may not love me as much as you loved your wife, and you're just like, I ought to really get out of this. And then suddenly there's a sort of atmosphere of potential for pressure.
But who decides in that situation? If you're saying, no, you dying person, you can't decide, because there may be various vague and dark forces at work. How does that...
Well, I mean, this is why it's very complicated. But I'm trying to suggest to you that the person simply says, "I choose this," is actually motivated by a number of factors, including the atmosphere in which you've created for them.
Yes.
And that atmosphere may be a good one or a bad one.
Yes, I happily agree with that.
Claire Fox.
I don't know if you'd agree with me. It's often discussed this, and understandably, as though we're talking about somebody who's racked with physical pain and so on. But actually, if you kind of look at the main reasons why they support assisted suicide, assisted dying, they'll say a whole range of things. Pain doesn't even feature. I mean, it's often loss of enjoyment of life, loss of dignity, and so on.
Yes, I mean, pain is the one of the symptoms that palliative care is best at controlling. But there are a whole raft of other rather horrible things.
Yeah.
Breathlessness, fatigue, plus, as you say, loss of autonomy, loss of dignity.
But I suppose then the question then is how do we stop a kind of broadening of the categories? I mean, last year in the Netherlands, hundreds of thousands of people signed a petition for euthanasia to extend to those over 70 who are tired of life. I mean, who am I to say, on your basis, surely it would be wrong to say, well, if they think that, well, then fine, let them have it.
Well, I'd turn it round, because I think when you look at it, there are several thousand people in this country each year for whom dying involves really serious suffering that cannot be alleviated successfully by palliative care. The public wants the law changed.
Well, I suppose I'm talking
about... The arguments are all about, well, if we change it, we may cause some problems. We've got real problems at the moment, and I think Parliament, the establishment, the church, if you like, are saying to these people, I'm sorry, you have got to suffer for the broader good of society.
But I think my question, I suppose, is just a little, if somebody says I'm suffering and, and life's not worth living, is it not our responsibility as a society now, in terms of the law, in terms of what you say is permissible, to say, please stay, is to actually put a value on their life and not to endorse. They say I'm suffering, you say fine, your life isn't valued. And even dignity, if I could ask you, I mean, there is great dignity, even what appears to be undignified or what you anticipate.
Well, they can be, but it surely ultimately must be the person in the situation to decide. Of course, we don't say, right, you say you're suffering, here's the injection.
But of course there isn't.
We explore it, we check, and in the proposed legislation there's a time period between two stages to check that people really mean it.
It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, you might be fed up of life if you had to go through all that. I mean,
that's one of my worries about what's.
My concern
but
is
you can't have it both ways. You can't have checks and say.
I don't want it at all. Remember, my point is that culturally and morally, there's a danger, is there not, though, of endorsing people giving up. Of almost encouraging them to, not cruelly.
I think the danger of this real suffering going on at the moment is a much bigger danger than that. That's the thing we need to address.
Dr. Wynyard, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Dr. Colin Hart, who is a supporter of an organisation called Care Not Killing Alliance. He was a full-time carer for 24 years for Alison Davis, who died 3 months ago. She had spina bifida, I think.
That's right.
Yeah. Had she ever wanted to die during that long period?
She did indeed. Alison had spina bifida. Her spine was collapsing from 1985 onwards. Life was unbearable for her. She made serious attempts to end her life, which would have been successful if she hadn't been found and taken to hospital, treated against her will, and revived.
So how did you come to the position you now hold?
She changed her mind, yes. She wanted to die for 10 years, between 1985 and 1995. From 1990, she didn't take steps to end her life because she began to think that there was a moral argument against it, even though she desperately wanted it and found life very, very difficult. And after 10 years, she found a reason to live. Now, she had the same conditions from 1995. In fact, they got worse. And so are we looking at conditions which dictate whether somebody should be allowed to exercise the opportunity to end their life, or are we just saying because people want to end their life they should be allowed to?
But her attitude changed. Matthew Taylor?
It used to be the case when religion held stronger sway, I guess, that people who committed suicide were buried in unmarked graves. Do you think that we should return to that?
That's not my concern where people are buried. My concern is about how we treat them while they're alive.
Do you think there should be sanction against those people who, there are various ways in which one might say to people, if you commit suicide, there will be a sanction. We will tax the estate of your will or whatever. Do you think that we should sanction people for committing suicide?
No, I think we should have a lot of compassion for those who are so desperate that they feel their lives have no purpose or value, and that's why I'm very much opposed to legalising suicide.
But if somebody with motor neurone disease, for example, decides on a Monday, at the point at which they are still able to reach out and put the pills in their mouth, to kill themselves, but on Tuesday to ask somebody else to do that because they can no longer do it, what is the moral distinction between these two things?
Well, if on a Monday they're able to rob a bank, but no, they're not going to be able to rob a bank the following month, do we say, well, they should have assistance when they're not physically able to rob a bank to rob a bank? I think you're making a distinction between ability and having a moral...
But that's my point. Robbing a bank is always wrong. But my point is this. if you are going to say that assisted dying is wrong, then you surely also have to say that suicide is wrong.
Yes, I believe suicide is wrong. I mean, I that's the point, and in fact, there is no distinction between.
So if you're going to punish people for assisted dying, which is what the law currently does, there is the danger that if you ask someone to help you die, you will know that that person could be prosecuted. Shouldn't you also punish people for suicide, or shouldn't you even punish people who don't stop people from trying to kill themselves?
I think really this is a circular argument. I mean, if somebody wants to end their life because they're so desperate and they try to commit suicide, we should have compassion, and instead of, if they survive, think of punishing them. We should do our best to try to enable them to live in a way that is happier for them.
But the point I'm trying to get to is, what is the distinction in terms of the state's intervention here? The state does not intervene. If someone makes a decision to commit suicide, we might deeply regret that decision, but we don't involve the state in saying, well, there's going to be some form of punishment as a consequence of that decision on the rest of your family or whatever. But we do say that when it comes to assisted dying. That's the distinction I'm trying to get to.
No, I think that the duty of the state is to protect human beings from harm, and you can't have a more lethal harm than having your life ended, whether it's at somebody else's request or your own. And in fact, we have a compassionate view towards suicide in that there is no punishment for anyone who attempts it, but quite rightly there are very strict objections to assisting somebody to end their life. There is a public policy in this country that protects life. We invest a lot of money in suicide prevention work. I think the fact that for some people, whether it is because they are terminally ill or because they have a chronic disability and we take a different view, I think that is a discriminatory, prejudicial view against people in those conditions. And I think we should be working to avoid and eliminate prejudice, not to be promoting it as you are doing.
Anne McElvoy?
I'm sure you're aware of the old saying, thou shalt not kill, nor shalt thou strive officiously to keep alive.
Yes, but of course that was a satirical poem, and it wasn't meant to be taken seriously.
Well, I think people can interpret it the way they wish. Some people might feel it expresses a view.
With respect, it is satire, and I think the fact that people are taking that seriously just show how they really fail to understand what Clough was talking about.
That might be so, but people do interpret poems differently. Therefore, do you not see a distinction between someone who commits suicide for whatever their circumstances may be and someone who asks for assisted dying when they know that there is no way back for them from a particularly painful, degenerative illness, who knows it's going to get worse? Do you not feel that there is a humane response, which is that is their will and that should be taken very seriously?
Well, that was the situation with Alison, who from the late 1980s, as I said, was in tremendous pain. She saw no way forward. And so you are suggesting that the compassionate response would have been to agree with her.
Well, it might well have been if that was her settled will. It clearly wasn't her settled will because she changed her mind. But that is, you see, if you don't mind me saying so, this case is so specific, then she goes on to live for a very long time and has a fulfilling life. But I don't think that makes a case very strongly for people who are not in that position, who are nearer to the end of their life or the end of their ability to make a decision.
No, I'm sorry.
Just let me finish the sentence. To make a decision about the end of your life. And I suppose I'm not asking whether you see any moral tension then in what the right response should be.
I'm sorry. The doctors thought at the time that Alison did not have long to live. Two doctors, as the law would specify if it goes through, would have said that Alison had less than 6 months to live. Doctors get it wrong. They have got it wrong in Oregon. The law this is the sort of basis of...
Are you predicating your case then on the fact that sometimes people get it wrong, but when there are so many cases when exactly what people think is going to happen then does happen, that we have to then have a moral framework to deal with that as well as the other cases, don't we?
I think that the idea that doctors can say somebody has 6 months to live, it has been proven to be drastically wrong in the case of Alison,
so
and it has been proven to be very wrong in the case of other people. And I think that if the law had allowed her to take her life, we would have been failing her. And I think we are failing other people if we say that because they are chronically ill or because they are terminally ill, that we should give up on them. I think it would be to deny the right, the value, the status of people who are vulnerable. And I think the repercussions would be tremendous as well.
Dr. Hart, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Dr. Hellant van Berla, who's a Belgian doctor. He's chief of clinic in the paediatric critical care unit at the University Hospital in Brussels, and he's one of those who campaigned for a recent change in the law in Belgium which extended the right to voluntary euthanasia to children with no minimum age. He's on the line from Brussels now. Dr. van Berla, how can you decide that a child is mature enough to make this terrible decision?
Well, first of all, as a doctor, I want to respond very shortly to what's been said before. And I think I need to reassure some people that we're not just changing the practice by changing the law. Terminating lives, whether it's called palliative sedation or euthanasia, is happening all over the world every day. Just because of compassion. And I understand that there's a lot of fear, but it's not that doctors are really waiting for this question to pop up from a patient asking to end his life. Usually we run very far and very fast from this question if we get it, because it's not what we trained for and it's not what we really want to do. So we will, as Mr. Hart said, as doctors also do our best to convince patients unless we think that they're absolutely right.
Doctor, I understand that. Can you actually answer my direct question, which is
Yes.
About children?
Yes.
How can you decide that a child is mature enough to make the decision? Very briefly.
Well, you're talking about children all the time, but we're not talking about children here. We're talking about terminally ill children. They've been sick for a long time or severely injured, and they're not looking to life and death as other children who never met something serious in their life. So these are children that mature, unfortunately, because we want children to stay children, but these children mature very quick.
I understand. Claire Fox?
Just an immediate reaction to that. When somebody's dying, when they've only got 3 months, whether they're 12 years old or whether they're 82 years old, those 2 days, those 2 months, those 2 weeks, a remarkably lot can happen. I mean, just because they're children who haven't got a future doesn't mean that the 2 weeks might not be precious to keep them alive longer.
I understand, but we're not talking about precious days or precious weeks. We're talking about painful and very difficult days or weeks. And the question will be, do we have to decide instead of the patient how long they have to go on suffering?
Okay, I think a lot. I think a lot can happen beyond the suffering in 2 weeks. But anyway, the point you've emphasised at the beginning there is the dilemmas for doctors. But is that not one of the things? One of our witnesses earlier said, ultimately this is about personal autonomy. But actually, if these laws change, it puts surely a lot of pressure on doctors to shift the balance from trying to keep people alive at all costs and do no harm to actually feeling under an obligation to do as the patient asks them.
I don't think so. Maybe you're even underestimating doctors now. We won't let us be pressured by anybody. Before we will comply with a question like a question for euthanasia, we will be sure that there's really no other way. And this is exactly what the patient wants.
Exactly. But when you say no other way, I'm not suggesting a cure is an alternative. But when you say what the patient really wants, there will be people, and you'll know this, that would really want to die because they're depressed or because they've had an operation that's gone wrong or because, there's a lot of reasons beyond a terminal incurable illness that they're going to die anyway. So how does a doctor decide when it's morally right to do that?
Well, that's exactly the point. It's not doctors that decide, it's the patient. It's their life, and we believe very strong in autonomy of the patient.
Okay, so therefore the doctor does have to do what the patient demands, and therefore if the patient, even if the doctor disagrees. But just one quick question, because I know they're going to move me on.
No, I just want to respond to that, because it's very important. We have to agree before we will carry out euthanasia, of course. So it's not just the patient asking, well, I'm done with this life because I'm depressed or I have a wrong operation. We will have to agree, and not just one doctor. There will be more. Okay. And in the case of children, even a psychiatrist, a pediatric psychiatrist.
Okay. A very quick question. Just 12 years ago, Belgium first legalised euthanasia. Now they've brought in, broadened the categories, and you can have euthanasia for terminally ill children in great pain. Do you anticipate, if we start this in the UK, that in 12 years' time we will also have this legislation?
I don't think so. I understand a lot of people are afraid of this so-called slippery slope, but there's you have to imagine that there's already this practice all over the world today. So the only thing we changed with this law is the way we deal with it. Now we are able to register it, we're able to control it. There will be a control organization looking over each case before and after, and this will lead to the best possible medical practice, even if it sounds a bit strange in these circumstances. But it's not the practice that we will change, it's just the way we deal with the practice.
Giles Fraser.
Do you think there ought to be an age of consent for sexual consent, minimum age of consent for sexual consent?
I'm sorry, can you...
Do you think there should be an age below which you shouldn't be allowed by the state to have sex?
I understand your question. It's also the same question as
but
if...
what's the answer? Sorry, just quickly, what's the answer? Do you think that there is a minimum age of sexual consent, yes or no?
Well, this is about healthy children, and we're not talking about healthy children.
Can you answer that just specific question? Do you think there should be an age of consent for sex?
Well, I don't see what this has to do with terminally ill children.
Just help me a little bit. Do you believe in that? Because here's the question. If you think that children can't, if you say they can't make up their mind about sex, they're too young to decide about sex, they're too young to decide about voting, but they are old enough and mature enough, they're old enough and mature enough to actually agree to take their own lives. That, for me, is a real problem.
Well, again, it's a difference between healthy children that should have age limits for a lot of things, and this is about terminally ill children. It's just not the same thing. These children mature too quick, and they're mentally sometimes older than people of 30 years old who never had something serious in their life.
So your argument is actually some of these children, which could be like 5 or 6 or 7, whatever it is, they actually mature enough. Really?
Well,
I mean, that's just bizarre to me.
You need to be checked by a pediatric psychiatrist, and we're of course not talking about 5 years old. You have to be able to think about life and death. So there's no minimum age, but there's the criteria of being discernible. So this will be checked by at least 3 doctors.
Dr. Bellard, thank you very much indeed for Van Bellard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Our last witness is the author and broadcaster Ruth Dudley Edwards. You've seen people close to you die. What conclusions have you drawn?
That it is possible to have a good death, and that in having a good death you are performing a service for other people, an inspirational service. And I had an experience of somebody who wasn't a particularly close friend, but I got to know him as he was dying over 6-9 months, a year. He transformed my attitude to death. He transformed my attitude to cancer, because this was at a stage when everybody was terrified of it. And he had a rough time. He had a much rougher time than he should have had. Not enough emphasis on palliative care. But he decided to do it well. And he did it well for his friends, for his family, for everyone. And it was a privilege for all of us.
And McElvoy?
I understand that must have been a very uplifting experience for you to witness as a friend and to take something away from. But do you not worry, and that this phrase, a good death, is beginning to bother me a little bit tonight in the conversation, that this quest for the good death, and that what we may individually feel is a good death, might be making us a bit befuddled, really, about people's personal autonomy and how they choose to die, which is not always as your friend did.
No, but in the end, you have to think of the good of society, really, in this. And I mean, I'm with what Claire Fox was saying earlier. The notion that you're encouraging a sense of pessimism in society is very, very frightening. The notion that you're saying to people, you know, essentially the message you're sending out is it's better if you just leave the stage. It's tidier for everyone. It's better for the National Health Service. And there's no point in hanging about.
I do understand that, because I think it is the message element is troubling here. But if we just flip it around, many people for many, many centuries in various forms have crusaded for the idea of personal autonomy, which various institutions have been very keen to take from them. And yet, strangely, when it comes to approaching assisted suicide and the genuinely held and thought through position that many people have, that it's what they want, we want to whisk in and say, no, it's the good of society you've got to think about now.
Well, I think this is because people with any sense of history have a sense of what this could lead to. And,
really?
And that is the terror of it. I mean, I know it's a terrible cliche to say slippery slopes, but that's what we got with abortion. There's no getting away from it. I reread the 1967 Abortion Act, or the salient points of it today, and how it has ended up, whether you're pro-abortion or not pro-abortion, was not what the people who drafted that legislation thought was happening. It was not what Parliament voted for. Everything was going to be fine because there would be two doctors, and two doctors who were God were going to make the right decisions. And of course, it just became a matter of somebody deciding they wanted an abortion.
I can see that's persuasive to people who are opponents of abortion, but perhaps not so much to those who aren't. But your slippery slope, which I think is a phrase often used and a view widely held, well, of course it's a slippery slope, because anything that has to balance what message you're sending to the rest of society with what is the right thing to do for people in extreme circumstances and pain who have expressed their will is of course slippery. But that's why we have to pin it morally, isn't it?
Yes, but we all know how many people have wished at times in their lives to die and change their minds afterwards, and this has come up again this evening, and that really negates it completely.
Do you feel anything for the people who didn't change their minds and weren't able to? Do you feel in any sense sorry for them, or that they were let down?
Of course I do. And I mean, I don't understand why far more of our medical resources aren't devoted to decent palliative care.
That's not what they wanted. They wanted assisted suicide.
Yes, they did at that time.
Matthew Taylor?
I'm sure we all aspire to the wonderful example set by your friend who smiled his way to the grave, but what on earth right is it of the state to tell people how they should die?
We're talking about assisted suicide tonight. I mean, I would tell you...
We're talking about the state's right to tell me that I cannot ask somebody to help me end my life. The state should be able to intervene and should be able to punish me by telling me that if I ask a relative to help me, that relative will be imprisoned.
The state's job is to discourage people from killing each other.
Right, but... Are you saying there's a parallel between people who murder each other in cold blood and somebody who asks a close relative in a situation of right at the end of their life to assist them in that death? Are you saying there is a parallel between me being stabbed in the street by a stranger and the situation we're talking about? This is ludicrous.
Of course I'm not. That would be ludicrous.
Well, that's exactly the parallel.
My mother said to me once, if she was ever in great pain and in terminal illness, would I kill her? And I said, if it was really bad, I would. And I would have. I very possibly would have. And then I would have told the police, and I would have been prepared to go to jail for it.
Right.
And I would have hoped that I wouldn't get 14 years. I would have hoped that, as nowadays, there is a certain amount of compassion.
Do you think it would have been a comfort for your mother to feel that if you had acceded to her wishes, that you would have been put in prison for 14 years? Do you think it might have been better for her, at the end of her life, not to feel that your loving act would have resulted in you being put in prison for 14 years?
That isn't the point at issue.
Well, it is the point at issue.
Isn't it? The point at issue
She wanted you to do something. Maybe she didn't ask you because she didn't want you to be put in prison for 14 years.
Well, I also concluded that...
the state said you're not allowed to.
She shouldn't have asked me to do it, actually.
She shouldn't have asked
No,
you
I
to
don't
do
think she should have asked me to do it.
Because
in retrospect, I thought it was weak.
Reply,
yeah.
She failed your she failed your good death test.
She was scared. She was a very brave woman. I think she would have actually done the good death extremely well if she was at the time fearful of getting something she didn't get.
Do you think it's possible that some people would have a better death if they knew that the possibility was there to ask somebody to help them end their lives if they needed it?
Of course I do. And of course there are many hard cases. I'm just saying I think it will be a catastrophe for society if we legalise this. And, the Belgian doctor, good grief. I mean, if he isn't an example of where we're going to end up, who is?
What about the catastrophe here and now of people who end their lives early because they are worried that if they don't end their lives early, they will get to a position where they're not able to end their lives. What about that catastrophe, here and now?
It's a very small number of people, and it is hard cases, and I'm not going to argue this on hard cases.
OK, fair enough. Thank you very much indeed. Such a tricky, a real dilemma, a real moral maze, isn't it? With some powerful witnesses. Dr. Wynyard, our first witness, doctor himself, in fact, former medical director of the National Health Service, talked about several thousand people suffering because palliative care, though marvellous in many cases, isn't always marvellous for everybody. And we were telling them that you have got to suffer for the broader good of society. How did you well, you didn't have a chance to respond to it. You've got a chance to respond to it now, Giles.
I mean, I don't think they have to suffer for the greater good of society. That's not the point. Suffering is actually, they're not suffering for anything. I mean, that's part of the point about suffering is actually meaningless. But suffering is, I'm afraid, an intrinsic part of life. And if you actually try and get rid of all the suffering from life, you actually often get rid of all the living from life. And that's a real problem.
Matthew?
I found the debate fascinating tonight because it's
that particular point.
It's completely flipped in what I thought. I thought this is a debate, on the one hand, between people who are kind of cold rationalist utilitarians saying if your life is over, it has no purpose, you may as well end it, versus people who are kind of believers in moral absolutes. And in fact, it's the total reverse. Because the people here who are driven by an absolute are the people who are driven by the idea that you should not force people to suffer when they don't want to suffer and their suffer has no point. The utilitarians are the other side of the argument. So they're saying, oh no, we can't relieve these people's suffering because it's the slippery slope. It'll be bad for society. No. They're the cold utilitarians.
I mean, name calling you can do, of course, but I think on a serious note, and it's a really serious note, it is undoubtedly the case that when you're dying of a horrible illness, you suffer. I know that. I mean, this is not a revelation. And if we're going to say that as soon as somebody starts suffering, then we're entitled to take their life, we become even more irresponsible. And even the way that this was framed, this programme was framed, we started off, Michael, with your introduction, rightly pointing out that this discussion is now framed in terms of Alzheimer's and people living a long time. And you can say, is that suffering? So then do we say, well, anyone who's got Alzheimer's then, they're suffering, maybe it's undignified for them. And so my concern is that when it comes to something like suffering, first of all, you can't abolish it. It doesn't mean you're not compassionate, but I do not want to have a sanction culturally, socially, that when somebody's suffering, that we don't do everything to alleviate their suffering,
including
but not by taking
their autonomy.
No, taking away their life.
Including taking away
and
their
once
autonomy.
their life is gone, that's it. But every day, every minute someone's alive, you can add one moment of joy if you can imagine such a thing. Death is final, that's it. Nowhere to go.
Yes, but I do think that rather omits conveniently, as I thought, we heard from the same sort of case from the last witness, but it does omit that it is what a lot of people want, and they're not making an unreasonable claim on the rest of society, and that you can, I think, draw quite reasonable distinctions between people who simply want to commit suicide on a whim and somebody who, other than in quite exceptional circumstances, a minority of circumstances, is more likely to die soon in extreme pain and does not wish to do so, whatever their reasons for that may be. Now, I do have a problem that this small L liberal autonomy, which I think has been very, very hard fought in many societies, is simply being washed away by the greater good of society and all sorts of other noble-sounding things and the good death, which people don't want to necessarily go down that route when it comes to themselves.
Matthew, the second witness, Dr. Hart, spoke about the woman he took care of for 24 years who had spina bifida, who was seriously attempted to end her life, but later, even though her condition actually got worse, changed her mind.
Yeah,
how do you argue that rather powerful?
I thought he was a very powerful witness.
Yeah.
But I think that what I felt we got to with him was that his position was consistent, and his position was that suicide is always a morally bad decision. Now that is consistent with the opposition to assisted dying. I get that. That's not my view. Of course, a 17-year-old who kills themselves because they've been chucked by their boyfriend, that is a disastrous decision, and we should do everything in society to stop someone doing that. But somebody who decides with a few weeks left to live that they don't want to go on, that's not a morally bad decision, that's an autonomous decision. I wouldn't judge it. And there's no difference between that and asking someone to help you.
No, you're quite right, there's no difference, but the suicide is itself a wrong thing to do, because it's not just about you. That's where this autonomy stuff is total rubbish. OK, if I decide I have been very dark, I have thought about doing it before, and when you think about doing doing it, what it actually affects is not just you, it's not just your autonomy, it's not your choice, it's your children, it's your family. It
It's not like
trickles out
that if
into
you've got 3
everything
weeks
else.
to live.
It's-
Well, if you've got 3 weeks
it's
to live, your
always
family
like
doesn't
that.
feel
Of course,
your family
who
doesn't
knows
feel
you've got
they've
3 weeks
failed.
to live?
They don't feel you failed if you do that.
First
One
of
at a
all,
time.
Matthew, you
Claire?
know, 3 weeks, a lot happens in 3 weeks. I mean, there's a lot of life you can live in 3 weeks, even when you're suffering, just to remind you of that. But on this autonomy question, because I think it's important, actually, this is a nonsense that people are giving the autonomy to control their life. Even the most enthusiastic assisted dying people tonight said there was doctors everywhere and lawyers and so on and so forth. This is not freeing people. This is the state apparatus surrounding you, protecting
You
the
can't have
back.
it both ways. You've got to have some sort of, you do have to have some sort of
I'm
check on the
allowed
system,
to
don't you?
finish my point.
You're removing the right to state.
Can you let me finish my point, which is that this is, if anything, going to protect doctors' backs, apparently, because they apparently are doing it daily, according to some of our thing, and they don't want to be prosecuted,
Can
or we
I-
want to protect the family.
Can I just pick that point?
Nothing to do with autonomy.
Claire, can I just pick that point up? Our third witness from Belgium, Dr. Van Berla. Of course, we were fascinated by the fact that this has been extended to children in Belgium, but he started by saying that this wasn't changing the practice in any way. It's just changing the law, because doctors routinely do this
I don't think they're
out of compassion. Now, we've heard from you, Anne.
Well, I actually thought he was an interesting witness. I could see that some people were a bit squeamish about the way he did have that sort of assumption that if 3 doctors said it was all right, it must be fantastic. But, you know, that's déformation professionnelle for you, and probably in Belgium as here. But I think what he did do was put his finger on the fact that we are sort of pretending that there is clarity, and there is not. Neither in the law nor in custom and practice is there any clarity about assisted dying.
but there
and
is
I think he was saying this is happening anyway.
Yeah.
So it is rather better sometimes to sort of tease out, and as society goes along, people live longer. It is not unreasonable to ask for a bit more clarity, even if you don't bring a sledgehammer to every hard
But what
case.
is wrong with the fudge?
Well, the problem is you can end up on the wrong side of the fudge. You can
Yeah,
end
but
up on the
the
wrong
fudge is-
side legally. You
it
can end up the
allows-
wrong side as a doctor, and you can end up as a wrong side of the
So
house.
therefore, you
And
change the
help
law to
someone
protect
else.
people's backs. And what I'd say is that this is a matter of fine, professional judgment, difficult moral dilemmas, and we should trust people. But it's also true that this idea that the quest is for a good death and that the doctor provides it, it's as though it's a kind of lifestyle choice. You know, I demand
But
a
the
good
ir-
death,
Exactly.
and the doctor's got to give me a good death.
The irony,
It's not the way
the
life
irony
is.
is, for those who articulate a utilitarian argument that people should not have this choice because of this slippery slope, the argument is actually more people are killing themselves early because they don't feel they have got
about
because
scaremongering.
they have the opportunity to ask someone to help them, and they don't want to get to the stage where they're not able to do it themselves.
This is not
Very
utilitarianism.
brief,
This
John.
is not utilitarianism. The idea that my own death affects other people and other people ought to be taken into account when that happens is not a question of utilitarianism at all.
Okay, that's it for this week. From our panel, Anne McElvoy, Claire Fox, Matthew Taylor and Giles Fraser, and from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was chaired by Michael Buerk and produced by Phil Pegum, and you can get more information on how to download The Moral Maze from the Radio 4 website. Between now and Easter at this time each week, we'll be asking some well-known people to deliver a Lent talk, which this year explores the theme of power. Our series begins with the American writer Bonnie Greer, who reflects on the power of names.
In the late 80s, when I still lived in New York City, some friends and I decided to bring a play over for the Edinburgh Festival. For my friends, it would be their first trip outside of the States. No one in their families had ever been abroad. Our families and our ancestors just didn't have the freedom of movement. We black people were restricted from going where we wanted to, either by law or by custom. That was our history. So this trip to Scotland was all very exciting, and we were brimming with things that we wanted to do. We, my friends and I, were all in the theater, so one thing we wanted to do was a bit of living theater.